You didn't imagine life would feel like this, not after everything you gave, not after the decades of showing up, making sacrifices, holding families together, bending without breaking. You believed there would be something on the other side, if not celebration, at least steady closeness. But now the days are quiet. The house echoes with time, not voices. Conversations are fewer. The calls come later, or not at all. You are not angry, not resentful, but something in you whispers, this isn't how it was supposed to feel. You thought the later chapters would bring peace, yes, but shared peace. A partner beside you, a family that still orbits around you, not drifts away. But here you are. And what surrounds you isn't failure, it's simply the shape that life took. One no one warned you might feel so solitary. Schopenhauer saw this clearly. He understood that most people carry expectations not shaped by truth, but by illusions. Illusions of reward, of reciprocity, of permanent roles. We believe if we give enough, we'll always be needed. That if we love hard enough, we'll always be remembered. But people change. Circumstances shift. And eventually, we're left with a silence that doesn't mean we've been abandoned. It just means the world has kept moving. And now, you're asked to live without applause, to sit in a space where no one watches and still feel worthy. That shift is disorienting. You may find yourself asking, is this emptiness? Is something missing? But what if it's not emptiness? What if it's clarity? What if, beneath the noise and the fading routines, something essential is finally visible? Not outside you, but within. Schopenhauer believed that solitude isn't a punishment. It's the natural state we've been trained to deny. He wrote that many suffer not because they're alone, but because they expected not to be. And that the pain of unmet expectation often hurts more than the silence itself. This isn't what you thought life would feel like. But maybe that's because you were told life would deliver something it never could. Permanent connection, predictable closeness, a forever audience. What if this moment of stillness isn't the absence of life, but the beginning of a deeper one? One that doesn't depend on recognition to feel real. One that no longer needs the old roles to continue in order for you to feel complete. You are still here. And now, perhaps for the first time, you are learning how to be with yourself, not as a placeholder until others return, but as the true companion that has waited patiently underneath it all, not the ending, the entrance. This isn't what you thought life would feel like. But maybe, in time, it will feel more real than anything that came before. We are raised, most of us, to believe that fulfillment comes from others, that life begins when we fall in love, that meaning is found in being chosen, being seen, being celebrated. And so we spend much of life seeking a partner to complete us, a family to reflect us, a circle of approval to affirm us. We learn to measure our worth by what we are to others: caretaker, provider, parent, friend. And for a time, it works. There's beauty in connection, comfort in shared lives. But beneath the comfort often lies something more fragile: dependence, not just emotional, but existential. The belief that we are not whole until someone else makes us so. Schopenhauer saw this belief as dangerous, not because love is wrong, but because depending on others to complete us is a setup for pain. He wrote that we create our own suffering by imagining others as the source of peace, when in truth peace was never outside of us to begin with. When we tie our identity to being needed, what happens when we're no longer needed in the same way? When we define love as being seen, what happens when the attention fades, when our names are not spoken as often, when our presence is no longer central to someone else's story. If you're feeling that loss now, the quiet sadness of being remembered less, called upon less, recognized less, it isn't a sign of failure. It's the result of having placed your deepest value in places that were always meant to be temporary. And that's not your fault. It's what we were all taught. But it is something we can unlearn. Because there's a different kind of life, not louder, but steadier, that begins when we stop waiting for others to make us feel complete. When we begin to look inward, not with bitterness, but with curiosity. What if nothing is missing in your life now, except the belief that something outside you was ever supposed to deliver peace? What if the quiet around you isn't failure, but space? Space to breathe without performing. Space to think without explanation. Space to simply be without needing confirmation that who you are still matters. Schopenhauer understood that solitude, when accepted, is not a punishment. It's a return to the self, no longer distorted by the mirror of others. He taught that fulfillment is not found in the approval of the crowd, but in the stillness of self-knowledge. And that once we let go of the myth of completion through others, we are free, finally, to stop chasing and start resting. Not in the sense of giving up, but in the sense of coming home. You may still love others deeply, you may still long for closeness, but you no longer need them to tell you who you are. You are no longer waiting to be reflected. You are learning to stand whole, even when no one is looking. And in that standing, a different kind of peace begins. There's a shift. It doesn't arrive loudly. There's no moment of thunder, no final conversation, no grand realization. Just a quiet day, maybe like today, when you stop chasing. You stop checking to see who remembered you. You stop rereading old messages. Stop watching the door. Stop imagining how things could have gone differently. Not because you're giving up, not because you're bitter, but because something inside you finally goes still. And in that stillness, something else becomes visible. You start to see how much of your energy was spent trying to stay visible to others, how much of your life was built around being needed, being appreciated, being understood, and how exhausting it was, always waiting for applause, sometimes literal, sometimes just a word, a call, a sign that who you were still mattered to someone else. But the moment you stop chasing, really stop, something surprising happens. You don't collapse, you breathe. And that breath feels different because it belongs only to you. Schopenhauer would call this the beginning of true freedom. Not the freedom of movement or opinion or even lifestyle, but the freedom of no longer depending on others to tell you who you are. It's not detachment, it's not coldness, it's clarity. The moment you stop chasing is not the moment you stop loving. You can still care deeply, but you stop negotiating your value through the lens of someone else's attention. And in doing so, you reclaim all the parts of yourself you gave away in the pursuit of being enough. You stop rehearsing the past. You stop crafting the perfect explanation. You stop trying to fix something that was never yours to fix, and you begin to sit, really sit, inside your own company, not with sadness, but with relief. Because you see now that the applause was never going to last, and that you don't need an audience to feel whole. Solitude becomes sustainable in that moment, not because it stops hurting, but because you stop resisting it. You let the silence be what it is. And in that silence, you find a rhythm, your rhythm, one not shaped by approval or memory or longing, but by presence. This is where acceptance begins. not in resignation, but in the calm of no longer performing. The world may not see you like it once did, but you see yourself now, more clearly than ever. And in that seeing, the chase ends, not with defeat, but with peace. Every man takes the limits of his own field of vision for the limits of the world. That's what Schopenhauer wrote, and it explains so much of why solitude feels disorienting at first. Because most of us, without knowing, have lived our lives inside someone else's vision. What family taught us, what culture reinforced, what friends, media, even partners mirrored back to us. We began to believe that what they saw must be the whole story, that love had to look a certain way, that success had a specific shape, that happiness meant being surrounded, being busy, being needed. And so we built lives on maps handed to us by others. Some of those maps were beautiful, some were useful, but most of them were narrow. And eventually we reach a point, often later in life, when we realize the road we're on has grown quiet, the crowd has thinned, and we're left not just alone, but unsure of what the road even leads to anymore. That's when the discomfort begins, because if we've spent decades walking someone else's map, we may not recognize the landscape we're standing in now. But solitude does something that noise never can. It expands our field of vision. Slowly, gently, it pulls back the curtain. We start to see life differently, not because life has changed, but because our perception has. What once felt like failure now feels like clarity. What once felt like isolation begins to look like freedom. You begin to understand that you're no longer walking someone else's road. You are now drawing your own map. And yes, it's unfamiliar. It doesn't come with signs or guarantees or company. But it comes with something else, honesty. You start to ask different questions, not how do I get back to what I had, but what is this moment trying to show me? You begin to notice things you never had space for before. A passing cloud, a long breath, a thought that leads nowhere and yet feels important. These small, quiet moments don't fit neatly on the old map, but they start to form a new one where you are not defined by your usefulness to others, one where peace is not conditional on being understood. Schopenhauer wasn't interested in the world as others told him it was. He wanted to see the world as it actually is, unfiltered, unpromised, undistorted. And he believed that solitude, more than any other condition, made that possible. Because in solitude we stop performing. We stop editing our thoughts to match someone else's comfort. We begin to see what's real. Even if what's real is quiet, incomplete, or uncomfortable, that kind of seeing changes us. It doesn't make life easier, but it makes life truer. And in that truth, we stop asking for others to validate the view. We begin instead to trust what we see, not because it's the whole world, but because, for once, it's finally ours. There's something strange, almost sacred, about the moment you stop needing to be noticed. For much of life, visibility was tied to value. The more you were needed, the more you felt you mattered. The more you were seen, the more real you felt. There was always someone to update, to check in with, to respond to. You moved in rhythm with others. But now, the rhythm is your own. And at first, it feels like absence. A kind of emotional disconnection, no one asking, no one watching. You wonder quietly, if no one sees this part of my life, does it still count? But eventually, something subtle begins to shift. You start to notice the calm that arrives in the space where performance used to live. You move more slowly, you speak to yourself more kindly. You do things not because they'll be noticed, but because they're yours. The tea you brew, the small walk you take, the page you read and reread. No one is keeping track, and that, strangely, is what makes it freeing. Schopenhauer believed that peace begins when we no longer need others to mirror our existence, when we stop chasing the feedback loop, the approval, the validation, the evidence that we still matter. You live in your own rhythm now, not dictated by obligation, not shaped by someone else's urgency. It's slower, but it's yours, and in that rhythm, you find something you didn't expect to feel again: presence. Even in a quiet house, even when no one's asking what you're doing next, there is still presence, because you've stopped performing. And in that absence of performance, there's a return to self. A kind of groundedness that doesn't rely on an audience to feel real. You're not invisible, you're just finally undisturbed. And in that undisturbed space, peace becomes possible. Not the peace of having everything figured out, but the peace of no longer needing to explain yourself. You are no longer preparing your life to be seen. You are simply living it, and that is enough. Before we continue, know this isn't the end of the video. If the stillness we've been speaking about feels familiar, if these quiet truths reflect something you've been carrying, consider staying connected. Subscribing isn't about numbers. It's about making space for voices like yours and people living with honesty, grace, and depth. And if you know someone facing solitude with silent questions, this video might say what they haven't been able to put into words. We'll continue in a moment. Let's keep walking this path together. Schopenhauer never measured a good life by how much someone had or by how many people surrounded them. He measured it by how deeply they thought, not in the academic sense, but in the quiet sense, the ability to sit with one's own mind without fear, without distraction, without needing escape. And that kind of life, philosophical life, doesn't always arrive early. For most people, it only becomes possible later, when the crowd grows thinner, when the obligations quiet down, when the house doesn't buzz with constant movement anymore, and at first, that stillness can feel like loss. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, it starts to become something else: depth. You begin to realize you have space to think again, not just about the past, but about life itself. You find yourself revisiting old ideas you once abandoned. Questions that were buried under the daily rush now rise to the surface. What matters now? What is peace made of? Who am I when I'm no longer needed the way I used to be? These aren't light thoughts, but they're real. And in that honesty, something meaningful begins to grow. Schopenhauer believed that solitude was not empty. It was fertile, a place not of absence, but of clarity. He wrote that the more a person needs others to distract them from themselves, the less peace they will ever find. But those who can remain inward, those who can stand in their own stillness, begin to see things others never will, not because they're smarter, but because they're quieter. The world tells us that aging is decline, that a quiet life is something to be feared or escaped. But Schopenhauer saw the opposite. He saw the later years as an opportunity, a rare opening into philosophical freedom, the freedom to reflect without interruption, the freedom to make peace with impermanence, the freedom to stop chasing explanations and simply observe. What if your solitude isn't a pause between things? What if it's the beginning of something deeper, something your earlier life didn't have room for? You don't need to write books or quote great thinkers to live philosophically. You only need to be present, to sit in the early morning without rushing, to drink your tea without performance, to think slowly, honestly, and without shame. That is philosophical fulfillment, and that is available to you now, not in spite of solitude, but because of it. You are not missing out. You are stepping into a part of life few are ever brave enough to face. The part where thought deepens, where illusions fall away, and where presence becomes enough. Not because everything is perfect, but because you've stopped needing it to be. There comes a moment, not loud, not dramatic, when you stop asking life to be something it never promised to be. You stop waiting for everything to come together. You stop asking, why didn't it turn out differently? And you begin instead to live inside what's real, not as a punishment, but as a kind of freedom. Schopenhauer understood something we're rarely taught. Life was never meant to give us everything. Not every love will stay. Not every effort will be acknowledged. Not every ending will come with closure. And still, there can be peace, not perfect peace, but honest peace. The kind that comes when you stop resisting what is. When you stop arguing with the past. When you stop asking the present to match the dream you carried for so long. You begin to see the world as it is, not as you were told it would be, and in that seeing, something lets go. The ache remains, yes, but the struggle softens, because now you know you are not broken because you're alone. You are not less because you are no longer central to someone else's story. You are simply awake. Awake in a way you couldn't be when the noise was louder. Awake in a way that allows space for presence, for reflection, for small dignities no one else needs to witness. This is not giving up. This is growing up into a life that no longer demands applause to feel real. Peace, in Schopenhauer's view, was not the result of life going right. It was the result of seeing clearly and choosing to live anyway. Not bitter, not defeated, but steady, quiet, real. You're not turning away from the world. You're simply turning toward it with different eyes, and finally perhaps seeing it as it is, and deciding that it's enough. At first, solitude feels like something missing, an absence, the conversations that no longer happen, the voices that once filled the room, the energy that used to come from being surrounded, needed, asked for, acknowledged. And when all of that goes quiet, the silence feels like a void, empty. But over time, if you stay with it, something unexpected begins to happen. You begin to notice that the silence isn't hollow. It has shape, texture, space, and not the kind of space that waits to be filled, but the kind that was always there, just covered by noise. Schopenhauer believed that solitude was not a lack, but a return to the inner life, to the part of us that exists even when no one else is around, the part that doesn't perform, that doesn't react, that doesn't chase. When you begin to feel that space, really feel it, you see that it isn't empty at all. It's full of things that were long neglected, thoughts you haven't followed in years, feelings you've pushed aside because there was no time, questions that never needed to be answered, just acknowledged. You are not waiting to be filled by others. You are uncovering what was already inside you, but covered by the constant pressure to stay visible, stay active, stay needed. Now you move more slowly, you listen longer, you notice the shape of your days in a new way. A walk that doesn't need a destination, a cup of tea that doesn't need a conversation. The world inside you begins to breathe again, and that breathing becomes the rhythm of your life. This is what Schopenhauer meant when he spoke of the inward path. A life that no longer depends on external input, not because it rejects others, but because it's no longer defined by them. You are no longer an empty vessel waiting for interaction. You are space. spacious, capable of holding memory, reflection, stillness, and peace. Solitude, then, is not the absence of connection, but the rediscovery of what was always present beneath it. You are not alone because you are lacking. You are alone because you are arriving, finally, into the full presence of yourself. Some lives are lived loudly, they are seen, applauded, noted, and others, maybe like yours now, are lived quietly, not because they matter less, but because they no longer ask to be witnessed, to feel real. Schopenhauer believed that a life lived for applause will always be restless, because applause fades, approval drifts, attention moves on. But a life grounded in rhythm, in presence, in truth. That life does not require an audience. You wake up and you choose gentleness, even when no one sees it. You prepare a simple breakfast, walk through your garden, sit with a book, not for display, but because it fills something wordless inside you. That is meaning, a kind that doesn't ask to be praised, a kind that sustains without needing to be named. There's a quiet freedom in that, to no longer need to be reflected, to no longer seek verification in someone else's eyes. Schopenhauer knew this form of freedom was rare. Most people spend their lives waiting to be witnessed, hoping that someone will say, "I see you, I understand, you matter." But the truth is, the most lasting form of peace comes when you say those things to yourself and believe them. You matter because you are still here, still breathing, still present, still capable of shaping your day from the inside out. Not because someone else asked you to, but because it is your rhythm now. You are not fading, you are refining. And while others may not see this chapter of your life, that does not make it any less real. The life that doesn't need witnesses is not lesser, it is simply quieter. And in that quiet, if you let yourself rest there, you may find something you were never able to touch while the world was looking, your own peace on your own terms. Not performed, not confirmed, just lived. Maybe no one said it before. Maybe it sounds strange, but it's true. Nothing is missing, not in the way you feared. What you have now, this quiet, this stillness, it's not proof of absence. It's the shape your life takes when it's no longer being stretched to fit someone else's needs. You're not unfinished. You're not waiting for the next person to arrive and make you whole. You're not stuck between chapters. This is your life, not lacking, but clearing. And in that clearing, something gentle is beginning to take root. You. Not the version others knew. Not the one you had to be when everyone was watching, but the person you've become in the absence of noise, in the absence of performance. Schopenhauer believed that peace doesn't come from perfect circumstances. It comes from understanding that we were never promised more than this: a moment, a breath, a mind that can think for itself, a soul that no longer apologizes for needing quiet. Nothing is missing. You don't need to be someone else's center to live meaningfully. You don't need to be heard by many to speak the truth to yourself. You don't need to be seen to still be here, fully, completely, peacefully present. The solitude you've arrived in is not a shadow. It's a light that no longer burns for others' approval. It burns inward now, warm, quiet, steady. Let it stay. Let it soften the old fear that being alone means being less. Let it remind you you are enough, not because someone said so, but because you have learned to be with yourself without needing a reason. And that, in the world Schopenhauer saw so clearly, is the rarest kind of peace. If you found something true here, something that helped you breathe more easily, we invite you to stay with us. Subscribe not just to follow, but to return when the world feels too loud and too fast. And if you know someone facing this same quiet, perhaps share this with them. You're not the only one walking this path, but in finding your own rhythm, you may help someone else find theirs.